Brian kept his eyes on the door, waiting for his beautiful bride. He loved Isabella very much and couldn't wait for her to finally become his wife. Most of all, Brian was struck by her sincere, touching kindness. He literally suffocated with tenderness for his beloved and knew for sure that he would never let her go from him. Their acquaintance was incredibly romantic. During a tour in the mountains, Brian usually preferred a different kind of vacation, but his friends persuaded him, promising that it would be fun. "Buddy, how can you work so hard? The whole life will pass by like that," said Paul. "Cora and I are going to the mountains, and Tom and Megan too. Come on, take someone with you and join us." "Yeah, I probably should get some rest, but if I come, it'll be for a couple of days, and I'll be alone." "Look, come on. It's been 6 years. Your Zoe won't come back. It's time to stop waiting and find yourself a normal girl." But Brian had stopped waiting for a long time. He just didn't see the point in associating his life with empty-headed beauties, because he hadn't met another type of woman on his way in a long time. And so the entire company gathered at the tourist camp, and there were 2 other groups of tourists in addition to them. Isabella was in one of the groups, but Brian didn't notice her at once. All the campers quickly became friends and had fun together. Isabella usually kept away from everyone, went for walks alone, and admired the beautiful views. All of Brian's friends came to the campsite with their wives, and after staying there for a couple of days, the man got bored and was about to leave. His friends tried to talk him out of it, but it was useless. Brian decided to take a walk and make some memory pictures. He climbed up the hill and stopped, admiring the sunset. "It is wonderful here, isn't it?" He heard someone's quiet voice beside him and turned around sharply. There was a beautiful girl sitting on a rock in front of him. She was so beautiful and graceful that it took Brian's breath away. "You're Brian, aren't you? I saw you at the camping site with friends." "My name's Isabella," she said casually. "Yes, and for some reason I haven't seen you before." Brian was surprised. Isabella told him that her cousin had persuaded her to come here to distract her from her sad thoughts. As it turned out, the girl's grandmother died 2 months ago. She raised her at an early age after her parents' death. Brian did his best to console and comfort Isabella, and they got to talking. The young woman told him a story about her wonderful grandmother, who was a very kind and sympathetic person. They often helped the homeless, cooked food for them, and distributed it on the square in front of the church. And one day, one homeless man, an intelligent-looking old man, fell in love with Isabella's grandmother, yet she was almost 80 years old at the time. He would come and just look at her with amorous eyes, and she would look at him, but they never talked about their feelings. Shortly before her death, the grandmother confessed to Isabella that she had fallen in love with this man when she was young. His name was Nolan. He was poor, and his grandmother's family was wealthy, and her parents were against their relationship. They insisted that their daughter marry another man, Isabella's grandfather, and she could not disobey. She lived well with her husband, but she was carrying her love for Nolan in her heart throughout her life. And then one day she met him among the needy. The grandmother immediately recognized him, but did not say anything to him, because she knew Nolan's character well. Having felt humiliated, the man would not come again. Yet they did not need to say anything. They communicated with glances. When Isabella's grandmother passed away, 3 days later, Nolan's heart also stopped. The elderly man could not stand the news of his beloved's death. Isabella finished the story and tears glistened in her eyes. Seeing Brian's sad look, she apologized for upsetting him, but he only sighed. "Yes, it happens in life. You know, a few years ago, I was in love with a wonderful girl. When I proposed to her, she said yes, and then she simply disappeared, leaving me a note not to search for her. It turned out that she had deceived me in the beginning. She said she had a family, but in fact she was from an orphanage. Her parents were alcoholics deprived of parental rights. That fact didn't mean much to me, but Zoe was too shy to tell me the truth. I loved her, but she left a note in my mailbox that she did not want to embarrass me and start a life from deceit. I searched for her all over the city for years, but it was useless. So maybe we'll meet again someday. Maybe in our old age," chuckled Brian bitterly. "Oh, I'd like to fall in love like that too, once and for life," dreamily muttered Isabella. Brian smiled and offered to help her with that. Isabella laughed, and somehow they immediately became closer to each other. When they returned to the camp, Brian changed his mind about going back to the city, making his friends pleased. All day long he did not leave his new acquaintance, and when they came to the end of their vacation and it was time to go back, Brian was happy to find out that Isabella lived in the same city, and that meant that they could freely continue to communicate. On their last evening at the campsite, they took a long walk through the surroundings, and when it got completely dark, they headed for camp. Suddenly, Brian awkwardly stumbled, not noticing a rock in the darkness. His leg twisted, and he had all chances to roll down the slope, but Isabella helped him hold on. She helped him to a small clearing and sat him down on the soft grass. Brian tried to joke about his awkwardness, but when he saw the anxious look of Isabella leaning over him, and he forgot all about the world. She was so close that he froze, afraid to move. Then feelings overwhelmed him, and he pulled the woman to him and kissed her. He thought she would be offended and leave, but Isabella stayed, and then he realized that they would never part again. And so it turned out. Back in the city, they continued dating, and 5 months later, Isabella agreed to become Brian's wife. And now he was standing and looking at the front door, waiting for his beautiful bride. Somewhere in the back of Brian's mind, anxiety was growing, but when he saw his beloved in a white dress with a happy smile on her face, he exhaled in relief. "You are beautiful, Isabella. I love you." "And I love you, my dear," Isabella replied. "But first I must confess to you that there is another person in my heart whom I love." Brian thought he was mishearing, but the guests also froze, afraid to miss a word. Meanwhile, the bride continued. "I'm sorry, Brian. I should have told you right away, but I had to know everything exactly and figure it all out." Brian felt as if the ground was slipping from under his feet. "What are you talking about, Isabella? Do you have someone else? And do you love him?" Pale with horror, Brian asked in a broken voice. Isabella tried to calm him down and explain, but Brian didn't want to hear any more. He felt he was short of breath and tugged at his tie with force. The guests also began to worry. The noise was growing. "Here, look at him," said Isabella and pointed her hand toward the door. Brian mechanically followed the movement of her hand and almost lost the power of speech. A little boy was running down the aisle toward Isabella. He hugged her joyfully, and she kissed him and said something fondly in his ear. "Do you have a son?" exclaimed Brian, gasping in amazement. "Yes, a son, only it's not my son. It's yours." answered Isabella calmly. Brian stared at the girl as if he had lost his mind. He could not understand how this was possible and what was going on. But Isabella spoke again, and soon all became clear. The boy's mother was Zoe, who had passed away 2 years before. She lived with an elderly woman, a former employee of the orphanage where she had grown up. Mrs. Rodriguez retired and hosted Zoe, and Tristan was born there as well. After Zoe's death, Mrs. Rodriguez took over the care of the baby. They lived poorly and often came to the square, where Isabella handed out food. One day the boy came alone and she found out that his grandmother was ill. She wanted to help them, so she went to their home. There on the wall, she saw Brian's picture and understood everything. Oh my God! Brian crouched down in front of the boy and took his hands in his palms. Brian, I took a DNA test and my hunch was confirmed. Tristan is your son. He is a very kind and sweet boy. With tears in her eyes, Isabella finished her story. Brian also could not hold back tears. He picked up the boy in his arms, embraced Isabella, and looking at his beloved in the eyes whispered, "You are the greatest miracle that could happen in my life. You gave me not only love, but also a son, and I will do everything for you. I have one more gift for you. I promise, the last one for today," Isabella smiled. "I will soon give you a daughter as well. I'm pregnant." "Oh dear, that's fantastic news! I am the happiest man in the world!" exclaimed Brian, and laughed happily.